So when I was working on plague in Bombay for this book, it's amazing how many times British officials would refer to the plague in London in the 1660s. That's 300 years earlier. They're referring to the plague, the Great Plague of the 1300s, which is the Black Death. So they had it in their memory. Right? Whereas when we are confronted with our biggest health crisis in 100 years, there seemed to be virtually no public memory that we had gone through a very similar Black Death kind of an experience, in the 19th and early 20th century. And that's another difference. The storing of memory has been much more systematic in Europe vis-a-vis in India. For such stark numbers, you would get some political ramifications. So one is, of course, the fallout, but it will also create a new class of leaders, which we will know only 20 or 30 years down the line. These are young political leaders who are in relief work right now, on the ground doing relief work. And so just like, we say, yes, Sardar Patel was a great freedom fighter, but he started his first public, work in the Ahmedabad plague of 1917. He was a ward member in the Ahmedabad municipality. So like that, in 2040 and 50, hypothetically, if Sonu Sood becomes prime minister, we'll say, oh, he earned his pearls. He earned his pearls during the COVID pandemic. So I think that's the kind of legacy. We'll see so many people who will be important leaders in 2035, 2050, who will look back on their careers and say, this was the pivotal turning point where we got out on the streets, started helping people. I think the first thing we need to stop doing is this continuous idea of, when will India become a superpower? I think the first thing that we should just admit is that we have a long way to go. Is this humility to say, these targets like $5 trillion economic targets and so on are kind of completely pointless when we have such woeful medical health infrastructure that is now being exposed by this pandemic. Right? I think we have to just, like we say in cricket, when you have a target to chase, say 450 overs, if you ask any of these targets which have ever been chased, they'll always tell you, these cricketers will tell you, we were not thinking of the target, we were playing it ball by ball. Right? That's exactly what we need to do. Just take it year by year.
So Chinmay, thank you so much for joining us, and for those of you who have tuned in, Chinmay Tumbe is a writer of The Age of Pandemics, a book that I totally enjoyed reading, and I couldn't stop reading it. In fact, I read it overnight, and I must admit that it actually ruined my sleep, and I ended up waking up in a daze the next day, and just couldn't work. And after that, since then, I've been talking about it, and I've been pestering Chinmay to engage with me, and he has finally agreed to join in on this conversation, because this book was an eye-opener as far as I am concerned. And I have been talking about this book to everybody who cares to listen. And one of the people I really, really want this book to be read by is my older daughter, and who's now 15, because I want her to understand the history of this country and how pandemics play out, and I believe that this will impact her future as well. And I could make out from the book that Chinmay wrote this book in response to a question that was posed by his son. So that's very similar. We have some similarities out there. So Chinmay, I think you will appreciate that. Chinmay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Farooq. Looking forward.
Great. So, Chinmay, while exchanging notes the other day, very brief exchange, I just want to ask, just start out by asking you, you mentioned that, you wrote this book in 10 months flat. Now, that kind of boggles my mind a bit, just how did you do it, and can you take us through your journey on that? Because I think of this as particularly interesting, because I would imagine on a theme such as this, where access to first-hand data and sources is acutely lacking. Just how did you go about it?
Yeah, it's been a very challenging project. My first book took about 10 years to write, and my second book, took 10 months in a field which I'm not, an expert or anything. I'm not a medical doctor, so I'd be doubly sure of what I was writing and so on. The inspiration really came on March 12th or so last year in 2020, when the WHO announced this as a pandemic. And I actually tweeted about the influenza of 1980, like a tweet thread about we should be careful about these things. And interestingly, when I look back at the tweet now, people have commented stuff like, "Oh, but that was 1918. Nothing like that can happen today," and so on, which is also interesting. But when I wrote that, the kind of knowledge that was being transmitted on say WhatsApp and everything else, we're talking about March 2020, was stuff like A, India has never been the source of pandemics. It's all from China. Or B, we have amazing immunity. Or C, we are vegetarians, so we have better immunity. So there were all sorts of these notions living in practically denial that nothing can happen to us and we are overreacting and so on. Which from my sort of training in economics, economic history, demography, I've been exposed to some of this literature on past pandemics of India, and I said, hang on, it just looks like this collective memory of pandemics, which really ripped India. The life expectancy rate was something like 20 years by 1920, which was abnormally low, even by global standards back then. That entire memory had been lost out. And so that's really what put the seeds of this project in my head. They're saying, hey, there's no book out there on the age of pandemics. And so that's how this project started. And then I realized that I was actually fairly well suited to write this because I had, during my research in economic history, collected a lot of data and statistics. And in March, I quickly sort of touched up that. And this is a mortality statistical database from 1870 to 1940. So 70 years of death data at the province level by, a source of a disease, that is whether people died of plague or cholera or influenza and so on. Of course, they're not perfect data, but something. So that 70 years of data quickly told me which parts of India were more hit. That's where I needed to focus more of my words on in the book. Which time periods were they more hit? What are the kind of process? How are people reacting to them, and so on. So that database forms the core of the book. And so the book has a supplement. It's called Pandemics and Historical Mortality in India, where I put in the statistics. So that's a separate 90-page document which is freely available online, where I actually have the time series of the statistics, a separate bibliography, and so on. So the book is a two-part project. One is the book, and then this is appendix. And then, of course, I had to find to write a book for a general audience, you can't just have numbers that would, bore the hell out of people. So you need to have a narrative. You need to try and explain how are people of those times, experiencing this, what was happening to the national movement, freedom movement, various other things, what was happening to the labor movement, what are the causes and consequences of this pandemic. And of course, I had to read a lot for that, but go through first person and skim through a lot of autobiographies to see people are mentioning this. Got a lot of serendipitous kind of references to these pandemics of those times, cholera, plague, and influenza in particular. And so by April or May, I had a decent sense of what was going on. I did the first book I read was the Encyclopedia of Human Diseases. This was in 1993. But this gave a nice history, a quick, one-page history of all the diseases in the world, all meaning, some of the major ones. This is a 1,000-page, it's like a classic encyclopedia. Because I said, look, I'm not a medical doctor, so at least I need to get the basics of this right. This book could be written, I thought, by a non-medical expert, because I was describing the pandemic as an event, not the technicalities of the disease and so on. And that my training in social sciences, different aspects, I thought that kind of helped in this process. But I had to know the science, and that's why you wrote this article on telling your daughter to study science. I think it's very important to. I'm not, I didn't do my training in science. I did do maths in my undergrad. I did my BA in maths and economics. But a reading of the basic literature on these diseases was very critical to get any sense of what I was doing. So it's stuff like case mortality ratios. The fact that for plague it was almost 80%, for cholera it was 50%, for influenza it was less than 10%. So these kind of things gave me some idea of how dangerous or severe these diseases were in those times. So this is in a way the broad process of the research process behind the book. A lot of it was serendipity. Just before the national lockdown last year, 2 days before that, I was in the South Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta, which is a tourist place. Right. And they had these burials recorded of the 19th century. And I bought that book, which is at the counter there. And so during the lockdown, I digitized that book and I started analyzing that time series. And you can see, 1817, there's a spike. And that's pretty much when cholera really broke out. And so, all these kind of crazy databases that I chanced upon literally before the pandemic really came into use. So 10 months is very short. If this was not pandemic time and I was just interested in pandemic, this is clearly a project that would have taken me 2 or 3 years. But I was also determined to get the book out purposely in 2020, in the year of the pandemic. And so that's really what drove me. Very crazy process. I had to be very disciplined because my first book, I missed all the possible deadlines. Like probably every first book like probably every book in the world. But on this, I had given myself this target saying it has to come out in 2020. I was also lucky to have a family very supportive and, bared my long absences at work. I would go into my office at about 10 in the night and come out at 6 or 7 in the office in the morning. I love it at night. So this is a crazy process of continuous research and writing for 10 months, which finally culminates in the book. And I should also say that when the book came out, the cases were going down. This came out in November, December. So we were on the downward slide of the curve, and we were in this phase where, we are done with it. And a lot of people also said, okay, this book is, interesting and all, but the pandemic is over. So, it's interesting that he wrote it, but it's on the way out. And of course, now there's a huge interest, in the book because of the second wave, which of course the book also mentions, second wave, like in the influenza of 1918, can be quite deadly and so on. So it's been an interesting process for me. Yeah.
Right. So, Chinmay, I'm going to take you up on each of these, that what you just articulated. One by one, I just want to go through all of this that you just articulated. Now, one clear takeaway that you stated right up front, and that stood out for me as well, and that comes through in the book, is how much India was impacted by pandemics in the past, and how badly our people suffered on account of that. Now, in chronicling all of the history, you have also touched upon how badly other parts of the world were impacted as well, such as Europe in the 14th century, when 1/3 of people on the continent died. Now, a question that comes to mind then is that why is it that people in Europe, that continent, picked themselves up and worked to revamp their public infrastructure over time? And whatever happened to us in India over century, in spite of us bearing the brunt of it all, is this a function of how our society is structured? What occurs to you? I mean, let's take UP, for example. I mean, that's a case that you have, that occurs a few times in the descriptions that you have articulated, and we are witnessing currently as well. How do you explain that? I mean, are there any hypotheses that you may have here?
I think if you just compare Europe and India, of course, there's no doubt that European medical systems are way advanced in the last, I would say, not 200, but since the late 19th century, when the bacteriology revolution took place, they invested much more in public health, and they saw dramatic improvements in life expectancy rates and so on. Having said that, of course, we know coronavirus has also affected them substantially.
Yes.
But a lot of that is also because of the age distribution. They're a much older population, and that's why if you look at the actual numbers, that's one of the big reasons as to why they've been hit much more than India in terms of per capita. But if you ask, they've definitely been more successful. They have a higher life expectancy rate than India. I think the roots, if you start from the Black Death event of the 14th century now, is something that happens in the 17th and 18th century, what they call as enlightenment. Enlightenment is, of course, it's a big word. It's very Eurocentric, self-serving for their own history. But I think what the Enlightenment did is create this scientific approach, towards a scientific outlook towards the world, where anybody could actually become a doctor with some dedication, some hard work, where anybody could become a scientist. You didn't have to belong to certain families, like in India with a very rigid caste hierarchy. You didn't have to belong to certain families to become someone great. If you, or it's kind of, it's a culture which respected curiosity. I think that's the key part of the Enlightenment. That is, you could ask questions like, you could admit that we don't know about a particular phenomenon and we need to know more. So it's not a coincidence that much of the vaccines which are developed now are all, coming from the same universities which produced the Enlightenment. I mean, some of the classic, discoveries that happened in the 1920s, whether it's Oxford and whether it's AstraZeneca or the universities in the US, it's that same continuous link which holds vaccine development today to all these guys earlier. In India, of course, we have Bharat Biotech, but even that doctor went to the US, learned stuff there, and then came to India and set it up. So that, if you look at the classic legacy of the Enlightenment, look at R&D expenditures to GDP. A lot of that cross configuration, even today, can be explained by really what happened in the 17th and 18th centuries in these countries. Having said that, they were not advanced. If you compare Western medical systems with Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha, Indian traditional medical systems, they did not really confer specific advantages until the late 19th century.
Right.
So there's a huge time gap. So when cholera strikes in 1817, everyone is clueless. It's not that these British doctors know how to survive cholera better than the Ayurvedic doctors and so on. But by 1900, there's a clear difference. And that's because people like John Snow systematically try and uncover the transmission. They don't take established, paradigms as sacred. They question it. They blow apart the 2 millennia old idea that diseases are transmitted principally through impure air, or what's known as the miasma theory.
Yes.
When he says that cholera is waterborne, it takes British officials in India about 40 years to accept that theory. And so many millions of people in India died because they continued to think that cholera was airborne, actually it was waterborne. So if you think of a person like John Snow, why is a guy like John Snow not being, in India or in China or many of these parts? I believe it's the spirit of curiosity, which the Enlightenment really, shuns. It's these kind of characters like John Snow who can operate. The church or the religion will not question these people, which is also happening in Southern Europe in these times. So there's a lot of leeway given to these scientists to push borders with this idea that it's okay to not know everything, and you can establish a theory, you can also go back if it's wrong. You see what happened in the last 1 year. There were a lot of theories about regional variations in mortality, why are Indians dying in lesser numbers than the Europeans and so on. But the hypothesis that we picked up was, some sort of what some people call as the hygiene hypothesis. That is, we grow up in really bad surroundings, and that's what gives us amazing immunity, and that's why we can survive corona much easier than the Europeans. This almost became a conversation, dinner table conversation, saying, "Oh, these Europeans are dying in large numbers because they don't eat street food like us." This became sort of, like a day-to-day conversation, which I've had with so many people, and I would keep pointing out to them, 40 million Indians died between 1817 and 1920 at a time when our hygiene standards were not that great, in that time. Right. So this kind of a natural immunity argument, which we latched onto, had no scientific basis, and that's coming to haunt us today because the second wave came about with a lot of complacency, built on such loose ideas as natural immunity. This would never happen in the UK and US unless you went through a scientific explanation of what causes mortality to be more. Their gut feeling, if you can't explain something, they'll say we don't know, right? Rather than latching onto the most attractive hypothesis and then kind of spreading it so much that people actually start believing that this hypothesis is true, right? And so that's the kind of difference, I think, in the scientific approach towards handling a pandemic versus once they realize that vaccine is important, you see what they've done. They vaccinated most of the populations in no time. Right? So that huge advantage has roots in history. And I would definitely attribute it to a scientific temper, which emerges. It's not that America is less religious, by the way. Right. America is a very religious country. But there is a certain respect accorded to scientists and their work, which whether you're a anti-vaxxer or not, it quickly dissipates through. And they've vaccinated something like, I think, more than 50% of the population in no time, whereas much of the world is lagging behind. So these have deep roots. If you're asking a question of why is Europe different from now, of course, it's a fascinating question of why the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, takes place there and not, and one can keep going back and so on. By one argument, the black death itself, killed so many people that it changed relations and it led to a lot of sparks. But it's a very controversial theory. I won't I don't really buy that theory. But there's no doubt that the Black Death itself was so dramatic for Europe that the scare of that pandemic lingered through centuries in their collective consciousness.
Okay.
So people. So when I was working on plague in Bombay for this book, it's amazing how many times British officials would refer to the plague in London in the 1660s. That's 300 years earlier. They're referring to the plague, the Great Plague of the 1300s, which is the Black Death. So they had it in their memory, right? Whereas when we are confronted with our biggest health crisis in 100 years, there seemed to be virtually no public memory that we had gone through a very similar Black Death kind of an experience, in the 19th and early 20th century. And that's another difference. The storing of memory has been much more systematic in Europe vis-a-vis in India.
Right. I find it very interesting, the point that you just made on the jump in medicine, medical knowledge that you just made, the one on, that there was not much of a significant difference in medical knowledge between the Western system of medicine and Ayurveda as we understand it, or Unani, and until very, very recently, until the 19th century. Do you think you could just delve on that for a minute? I mean, what was that inflection point, so to speak, and why did that jump happen? I mean, is there what does your when you
Yeah,
look at it,
I think
what explains it?
it's fair to say that the jump really happens to this new field called bacteriology.
Right.
And then people were speculating. Okay, why do you get a disease? The air has changed, the season has changed. There was this speculation. It's
Right.
when people like Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch from France, Germany, respectively, they're probably the greatest names of that era, late 19th century. They basically started looking down. Of course, looking through a microscope had happened, started from the 1600s, but they got more powerful microscope. I'll give a classic example. Florence Nightingale was this very well acclaimed, very famous, person of the nursing profession, wrote extensively on public health and sanitation in India. She believed that diseases were airborne and all this bacteriology is nonsense. And she changed her views only when somebody gave her a microscope in the 1890s and said, look, this is what caused diseases. So they got that particular scientific advancement, and with it's not just by showing certain things floating around on the slide under a microscope that people be convinced. With that came the vaccine. With that came the medicine. So they developed a cholera vaccine. They developed a plague vaccine. They started vaccination drives on various other things. They could demonstrate the utility of their science through bacteriology, saying if we understand the disease-causing agent, we can conquer the disease. So this became a very powerful philosophy in that scientific tradition. And so the inflection point really is the late 19th century where bacteriology comes into play. And of course, Indian scientists, then being trained in many of these places, realize they see the value. One classic metric to see, how this happens is to see the mortality of Britishers in India. So Britishers were actually dying in the same rates as Indians in India in the early 19th century. But by 1900, the death rates among the British in India had fallen substantially because they had started adopting these new practices that were emerging in Britain, which had not yet dissipated across the Indian population. Right? And so in India, suddenly the British were out-surviving the Indians in India, which was not happening in the early 19th century, but by 1900 it happened. And that inflection point was bacteriology, also a change in sanitation practices, this idea of public health, and that the government can prevent pandemics. For example, once they understood that cholera is waterborne, they invested in water purification systems. That cut down cholera mortality dramatically in the late 19th century, for instance. So these are the kind of things. The bigger question, of course, why did the British not invest as much in India? So they did it for Britain, but they didn't do it in the colony. And of course, that has probably imperial logic and so on. But there's no doubt that the West improved themselves in the medical terms substantially, and did not confer that advantage adequately enough to its colony.
Right. Now that's a good segue, for instance, to just kind of slide into the debate that you had touched upon for instance, in the chapter on cholera, on the medical debate, because because I'm looking at it from a contemporary perspective as well, where a question occurs. The medical debate, the two schools of thought, the transmissible diseases versus the contagious diseases debate that seemed to be happening at that point in time, which you touch upon in the chapter on cholera. Can you take us through that, and where do you stand on it currently? And the reason I'm asking you this is because when you wrote, when the book was published, it was last year, and as we are having this conversation, which is almost a little over a year later, we are witness to multiple debates in the medical community itself on what kind of protocols should be adopted in terms of dealing with this pandemic itself, in terms of, the layperson, is plasma treatment the best, is remdesivir, you have these multiple kinds of protocols. There are countries which believe in masking up. There are, and so on and so forth. There are others which say that, okay, if you're vaccinated, it's all right, So the medical fraternity itself seems to be completely divided, and there seems to be this whole debate, and you've looked at the history of medical debates, really, So I was coming at it from that perspective.
It's fair to say that you can't really effectively curtail a pandemic without understanding its transmission. So transmission is really, really key. That's how plague was eventually understood. Plague haunted civilizations for centuries. It was finally understood. But let's start with cholera. That debate was essentially whether it's airborne or waterborne. After John Snow had demonstrated that it is waterborne, and he showed by various means, he showed that two houses, neighboring houses, one gets a pipe served by two different water companies. One gets water from upstream, one gets from downstream. Wherever it mixed with the sewage, which is human discharges, he established what is known as a fecal oral transmission. That is where our stools go in, go out, from bowel movements and so on. And if that sewage is basically going into the drinking water source and that gets contaminated, then that's how we ingest back the cholera bacteria. He didn't use the word bacteria, but that's how we get cholera in our body. Now, this was hugely controversial at that time. And as I said, for 40 years, the British officials in India did not accept this here. And this idea that it is impure or dirty environments which cause cholera was so strong across the world. A famous German sanitarian, as they were called, a guy called Pettenkoffer, was so strongly wedded in this view. So he also, when they started identifying these cholera bacteria, he also ingested it. He took a glass and said, "Oh, nothing will happen to me," and so on. And finally committed suicide because nobody knows why exactly. But it's an interesting case of a person adamant in his ideology when clearly cholera was mostly a waterborne. Now the question was, why did the Indian officials adhere to the airborne thing? Now they had a very good reason, and their reason was simple, that it was seasonal. They saw when they projected cholera on months, they saw that cholera happened in certain regions only in certain months. And he says you can't get that by just having water. There's clearly some climatic factors that matter. And the latest research on cholera actually suggests that there might be a hint of truth to that, right? In the sense that it is not completely wrong of what those airborne theorists were saying, but there's no doubt that the bulk of the way cholera came into human bodies was waterborne. So there might have been some airborne factor to explain seasonal fluctuations, but the waterborne was the main kind of transmission system. And of course, the Indians finally, realized this, and we realized wherever we could put water purification systems, cholera. In Calcutta, most famously, cholera rates, mortality rates started coming down the minute they got water purification systems. So there was plenty of preventive kind of evidence to suggest that. Similarly with plague, the transmission people thought was again impure. Dirty neighborhoods get plague. With plague, you could observe that rats died and then humans died a few weeks later. That was the that was the correlation seen for centuries. As I mentioned in the book, a lot of descriptive accounts of rats dying and then humans dying. But nobody understood why. And then so this guy called Liston, in Sikandrabad-born medical officer, who basically pointed out that it's because the rats died and the rats keep sitting on them, get hungry because there's nothing to bite, and then they start chasing anything around them. And that if the rat is close to you, they'll start biting you. And that's how from the rat or the rodent, plague is transmitted to humans via the rat. This was a brilliant insight which kind of demolished all other theories. So, for example, disinfectant, which is the primary first up use that people did during plague, was completely useless. Right? When people realized that the main thing was rat proofing. If you didn't have rats in your locality, then and if you didn't have rat fleas, then that was the way to really save yourself from plague. And unfortunately, this wisdom came very late in the day. But as it emerged, of course, all the other practices started going on. Now, cut to the coronavirus. The reason why you have different theories is that when a pandemic emerges, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so we try different things, hoping that at least some of these things might be right. Right. So if you look at the protocols established now, mask is the number one thing. I think mask is one thing where it's quite unlikely that 30 years down somebody will come with research and say, oh, that was actually not required. Right. Like how we are saying now that disinfectants were not required for plague, when at that time people said, oh, you have to use disinfectants everywhere. Right? So it's very unlikely, I think, that the mask thing will work. But think of things we did last year.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there. Did you say it's very unlikely that the mask thing will work?
It's very unlikely that somebody will say later on,
okay,
masks were redundant, or that the principal transmission mechanism was so different that I mean, just hypothetically, suppose somebody discovers 30 years that it was going through skin pores, hypothetically,
sure.
Which basically mean that masks were redundant, right? In the sense that masks per se need not have been the case. And I think the science on mask wearing and effectiveness is well established over the last 1 year. They're showing clinical, surveys are these surveys are showing, randomized surveys are showing that masks seem to matter substantially. So that's why I'm saying different protocols that we established will take time to establish themselves. But the fact is that when a pandemic emerges, we are all clueless. Even the scientists are clueless. And there's a process of learning across the course of the pandemic, right, of what works and what not. So last year, for example, surface transmission was a classic thing, right? And so a lot of people, sanitizers, whatever parcel came, you scrub it. And of course, people also said, look, I didn't touch anyone, I didn't go anywhere, and I still got COVID, so it must be through the parcel. So people, of course, we develop our own kind of intuitive logic about what might be transmitted, right? But now, of course, the evidence on surface transmission says the probability of getting it that way is very low, right? Okay. And of course, what you're referring to, of course, now is this, big thing which happened over the last month, is that the WHO now recognizes it to be airborne, which is basically saying that it's not just through droplets by coughing or sneezing, it could last in the air for substantially a longer period of time. So they found that two people quarantined in two different say you're in a hotel where in two different rooms, by the classic method that WHO was saying last year, you should not have got COVID. In the sense, if you're not within coughing and sneezing range, you should not have got COVID. But they found evidence that people were still infecting each other, which means that it was in the air for a longer time. I think the evidence on Delhi right now will also probably show something of that. So this idea of airborne, which was mixed evidence, now there's more evidence to suggest that COVID is airborne. What we mean is that we know it was airborne, but it's about how much longer does it stay in the air, right? And so that's the key. Which also means that the classic protocols of keeping our distance and so on are important, of course, but it also means that ventilation, for example, becomes a very important protocol in these systems. Right? And now, interestingly for me as a person of history, when I looked at the protocols of WHO now and 1918, when the US had developed a lot of protocols, back then also masks were used. Back then also they emphasized cleaning hands and being clean and so on. But back then, a huge emphasis was on ventilation. And in fact, there's a picture in my book of the protocols of done in the US. There's a picture of a lady with a mask, and the protocols described next to that. And ventilation is written there. And so I was amused that just last month now ventilation is back in the protocol, or it is going to emerge as an important protocol going forward with more evidence coming on. So there are two ways to look at it. One is to be very cynical and say, look, we did all these things and they were not correct, and so these scientists were wrong. Another way, the scientific way, is that you're guessing because we don't know much. There's some things which seem to matter much more than others, right? But clearly, with more evidence, we should be discarding some of the practices that seem to be completely useless. And so masks, people will still say are very, very important, and that's why we are continuously wearing these masks as we go out and so on. But these protocols do change over time over the course of the time. In a way, I would say we've been lucky that we, because of the global research on coronavirus, which is also unprecedented, so much effort trying to understand the coronavirus, that in a way that from the time that the coronavirus emerged, let's say, in this pandemic form last year, to the what we know about, we still don't know too much about the virus, right? But what we know is substantially more, I would argue, than for any previous pandemic, where it has taken many times years, if not decades, to know what was happening. Right? Cholera, it literally took, 1817 the virulence from, 1854. So after 3 or 4 decades, they found out okay how maybe it's waterborne. And it's until an Indian scientist in the 1950s, a guy called Sabunand Dey, who actually identified how cholera attacks the human body. Right? So that's 150 years after the disease became very viral, and that they actually figured out how it works. And today cholera is not dangerous because we have antibiotics. We have, thanks to Sabunand Dey's work, we know a lot about cholera. So cholera, even if it strikes us, the case mortality rates are negligible today. You just have to take some salt and water, and you're fine. Right? So that's the beauty of science, that we have kind of consigned cholera to the history, right? But and that's easier with bacteria than viruses, and there's some biological reasons for that. And hopefully, science will progress so that coronavirus will also become. Of course, some new stuff will also emerge in the future. But I think the right way to look at this is to have the scientific temper, to basically look at it and say, what works, what does not work, and have the humility to know that some of these things we are doing at the onset of a pandemic may not be required later, but right now we're just using it as a basic precaution.
It's absolutely fascinating, the part on transmission that you spoke about, and the history out there, particularly that this could be airborne, and how the understanding of that is evolving, and how it there was a history to that in the past as well. That is absolutely fascinating. And from there, I just want to shift a little bit from there to the public policy part, because you had alluded to that as well. Particularly in the chapters, let's say, for instance, from public policy, when clarity emerges over the years that urban reforms are called for, and I think you've touched upon this at various points in time. Why does it take policymakers as long to work on it? Say, for instance, you spoke about the correlationship between piped water and low mortality rates. And the evidence was there for everyone to see in Kolkata, for instance. Now, that Kolkata took as long to implement it is one thing. Now, let me assume for a moment that perhaps it was terrible administration at that point in time, or whatever the case may be. But there were others across, this is a federated structure, there was a central government in place, but there were other public policymakers as well who could see this evidence. So what is it about public policy and those in public policy that, who cannot see this evidence, or who refuse to see this evidence, and why does public policy lag the evidence? Is it willful blindness? What is it? What explains the gap?
That's a great question, and very relevant even today. I mean, we still have such low provision of public goods in so many parts of India. As a trained economist, I tend to see stuff as demand and supply. So, is it because the demand is low for such intervention? Is it that people who are just ascribing, say, cholera to to acts of God, and that nothing much can save us? And if that is the kind of thinking, then there's really no demand for these preventive services. And then there's a supply, that is how much of it can be supplied. So do you have the funds available for it? Do you have a state, what economists would call a state capacity to deliver it? In the case of Calcutta, it's very interesting. I mentioned that the pipe water was introduced in 1869, and after that cholera mortality started going down. They did this only for the parts of Calcutta where the elite were living. So this is where the British were living in this one. And the pipe water extension to the rest of the wider suburbs and took much longer. So even within Calcutta, you can see that the supply came because of a massive demand, and the demand was from the elite, where they said, this seems to be working in the West, in Europe, and so we should try it out here, and it seemed to work. And the
Just
question is,
let me just sorry, I'm sorry for butting in here, Chinmay, but you just said that piped water came into the elite parts of KL and there's a demand for that. Just from my understanding, were they billed for this? Was there a billing system in place? Is it because they could pay for it? I mean, was this a metered system of piped water? What was going on?
it's a good question. I don't know if it was meter, but definitely they had to pay for it. Definitely, water was it was not a completely free good, and so people didn't have to pay for water. Came as part of a whole set of municipal reforms in that period. The thinking of that it took many decades, but it was finally done in the 1860s. So similarly, if you, I'll give you another example. A medical officer, which I mentioned about, a guy called M.C. Fernal in South India. He writes a book called Cholera and Water in India in 1884. So, and he's obsessed with this idea that cholera is waterborne, and he's absolutely right. But none of his seniors are accepting. He think of him as a lower level bureaucrat who wants to establish this idea of water purification, and he's basically arguing that we need clean purification, water purification systems to end cholera in India. And he has all these things in this pamphlet about what to do and how. Now the interesting thing is who listens to him. And none of his seniors are listening to him because they are steeped in that scientific paradigm of airborne transmission. So that's one explanation of why the British did not invest so much in piped water in that time. But the people who are listening to him, one of them is the guy, the Maharaja of Travancore. And this is a classic, another example of the roots of Kerala's public health, reasonably good public health, is this Maharaja, kind of a progressive ruler, said, okay, this guy is maybe making some sense. So he writes to this MC Burnell and says, why don't you come and give us a demonstration of what you're saying? So it's about people with these ideas, but who has the demand for it? And MC Burnell's ideas had more take up for people who wanted to do something for this subject, right? Who could see that if we can test out different theories, because cholera was rampant, it was ravaging India. And so there was a demand from certain quarters saying we need to do something to save lives and need to try out different things. Right? And so that demand, so I think it's a combination of demand and supply. In the case of the British, the continuous lament from the Indian freedom fighters was that you're doing this for your own people back home. Why you're not doing it out here? And that is a fundamental disconnect. Right?
Okay.
A deeper question is, what changes after 1947? Because then the British excuse disappears. You can't blame everything after 1947 on what the British should do. And there, I think we've continuously underfunded health. So even piped water to villages, right? You would think it's not just cholera. It is diarrhea, dysentery, virtually a whole class of waterborne diseases that can be completely snuffed out the minute you get piped water into your house, right? So there are huge benefits of having this. But yet we have to wait for the past decade where this was, taken up in a big way. For almost 70 years after independence, it has been so slow, right? And so it's a combination of demand of people not seeing the benefits. It's a combination of supply where the state says, we don't have money to spend on these projects, which has kind of got us into a lot of public health mess, I think, over a long time. So this is not just a story of British neglect. It's something deeper than that. It's a story of systematic neglect, until today in matters of public health.
Right. And the that also leads me to ask you, the point you made, sometimes, we wonder about, these acts of God, so to speak, and we have, this is something that completely beats me totally. And that is why this question to you, there is evidence, and, as you pointed out, about a direct relationship between large religious gatherings and the outbreak of diseases. But we are witnesses to that now. I mean, whether it be the Tablighi Jamaat or whether it be the Kumbh Mela, as in right away, what we're seeing, and that there seems to be the evidence. What is going on? I mean, was this an erasure of memory or convenience? So how do you kind of see this? How do you interpret this?
Yeah, it's also very perceptive. I think it is the erasure of memory. Like take the Kumbh Mela, and the equivalent in the Islamic world will be Hajj pilgrimage and so on. People need to realize about the history of the Kumbh Mela with epidemics. It has been so continuously linked with epidemics for so long, right? And just because, we've not had serious outbreaks in the last 30, 40 years doesn't mean that it doesn't have a history of outbreaks, right?
Right.
People should also know that in the past, Kumbh Melas have been suspended, right? And in the 1930s and 40s, it was compulsory for a pilgrim, if you had to go to the Kumbh Mela, to get a cholera vaccination certificate. So you could go to the pilgrimage only after you had got the vaccination certificate. So these are public health measures which have been taken in the past, right? In the age of pandemics, closer to that period, where of course Kumbh Mela was closely related with cholera because cholera is waterborne. It was, these were classic sites because imagine, people bathing, right? And this is a fecal oral transmission. People are drinking the same water. They're not only drinking the same water, they're taking the holy water back to their villages and sprinkling with their ponds. Right? So it's a classic diffusion of the cholera bacteria across much of northern India. And there were, various studies establishing, for example, cholera is not very endemic in Punjab, but people realized that whenever the Kumbh Mela happened, Punjab province, which is a large province, including much of present-day Pakistan, much of Punjab would be affected by cholera. Why? Because the pilgrims would come back and cholera would spread in those regions. So they plotted these time series, and clearly the Kumbh years had an effect. So there is a history of the Kumbh Mela, not just the Kumbh Mela, not just Hindu religious sites, Christian religious gatherings, Muslim religious gatherings, basically large gatherings in India, which in terms of scale happen almost primarily because of religion. The only other two large gatherings in India is maybe a cricket stadium or a political rally, right? But we're saying religious gatherings are, typically the ones with more than 50,000, 100,000 people. And so we have a history. And so it is very surprising, that this year, we went ahead with some of these big events. And I'm not singling out Kumbh Mela. There should really have been a ban on all large gatherings exceeding certain thresholds. I'll also give an example. Maharashtra this year did ban this Pandharpur Yatra. Right? So there are also examples of people who had the ear to the ground and they said, okay, nothing doing. And it's the second year in a row, by the way. And so, but the way they did that is very interesting. You can't just say, oh, I'll ban this thing, because then you get a revolt. Public health policies need to take people into confidence. That's also what the British realized, and that's what all of us have realized today. What the Maharashtra government apparently did was to sit down with the people who organize the yatra, the people who do the pilgrim, basically important leaders, and said, this is the gravity of the situation. Please understand. You need to sit down with those religious leaders, explain the situation with them, and break it down in simple words. That is how effective public health is. So people don't realize that not doing the yatra is actually saving lives. If that message filters in, then people on their own will, you'll have public support for not having that pilgrimage in that particular year. The Hajj has been scaled down dramatically, right? So this year they put down the numbers. Very few people who go to the Hajj. And again, the message is very clear that, we are taking certain steps to kind of curtail these large gatherings. So there is a lot that we can learn from history, especially on this. And when the Kumbh Mela was held this year, I just thought it was, this is even before the second wave hit. You could just see those images and think, that this is not on. Now the hypothetical situation, that suppose the second wave never hit us. Suppose nothing happened between February and now. I think it would still have been irresponsible, to hold large gatherings, because when we're seeing the second wave around the world, you have to take precautionary steps. You can't just say, oh, like I think our High Court has mentioned Ram Bharosi. That is, you just leave it. You kind of take a chance. Second wave may come or not come. Let's have the Kumbh Mela and see. But Kumbh Mela is, it's millions of people at one site. It's a classic, event which is good for the virus and bad for the people. So again, I'm not singling out the Kumbh Mela.
Sure. I totally get that.
All religious gatherings, but religion is important because across the class of large gatherings, religion typically is the largest, right? So more than cricket stadiums, more than political rallies, it is really religious gatherings which encounter. Even the local mosques will take 1,000 people and so on in many cases. Local temples, and definitely they should have been. Now, of course, you'll say this is hindsight. This is all hindsight posturing. But I think there were a lot of people pointing out that we were not out of the woods yet completely. And so I think the learning from history should have been there. That, and it should have been articulated that this is not the first time this has happened. That yatras have been cancelled in the past. It's not like you have to have the Kumbh Mela. In the past, also people have suspended. They've done vaccination compulsory to go there, and so that sort of communication might have been useful. So to answer your question, I think it is an erasure of memory, erasure of memory about the connection between epidemics and pilgrimage sites.
It's fascinating the point that you made that until it was not until too long ago that you had to have a certificate uh, to go, and then we just forgot about it. And I must point out here that there were some anecdotes that do come up in your book around around the various how religion is perceived and the role of religion across history, and that kind of stayed uh, with me, and which is where this
The other way religion enters pandemics is scapegoating. So the idea that especially if you have some sort of polarization. So in the Black Death, the Jews were blamed. For
the Jews were blamed. Yeah, exactly.
The idea that if you think it's an act of God or you think it's an act of an outsider, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy to blame because obviously pandemics raise anxieties, grief, and so you're looking for someone to blame, right? And so India classically, if not China, then something within. Who to pick? So last year we had the Tablighi Jamaat as the classic.
Yes.
So clearly, and of course, Tablighi Jamaat should not have had that congregation. I'm not supporting. That.
I mean,
It was kind of outside. A lot of other things were also happening in India, but that was kind of picked on at that point. I mean, a lot of politicians had large weddings at the same time. We're talking of like post mid-March last year. So it was kind of unfair. So that's another thing that pandemics do in terms of heighten these religious divides, unfortunately.
Right. So I just want to shift gears a bit, Chinmay, here and go to a theme that you have been researching for a long while, and if I could do a deep dive out here on this with you, the theme around migration, for instance, and pandemics. Now you have touched upon you in the current book. You have touched upon, you are, for example, Jessore as a cluster, for instance, as a center for indigo processing. And the point you made about, when a pandemic strikes, about how people move out of a cluster. Now, question that occurred to at that point, when reading that, that, hey, here is this cluster that is thriving and doing well, and it's a that's doing well. Now, whatever happens to a cluster when migrant labor leaves a place, and and what happens to the place that a migrant goes home to? Because I think you have made the point earlier that if I have to die, I might as well go home to die too. What happens to these economies? And the reason I'm asking you this is because what I do have is anecdotal evidence currently, basis multiple conversations of people wanting to leave cities such as Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, and move to tier two. And I'm not talking of migrant labor as we would classify them, but the quote unquote, and I very deliberately use this, middle class people move to tier two. But I'm sure you would have done a lot of research on this, and this is something which is very close to your heart. So,
sure, yes. There are two aspects. One is what happens to migrant labor in particular, right?
Yes.
Construction workers, the whole vast informal economy, from cooks to plumbers to drivers, to this whole economy that runs our cities, and how that is, how does reverse migration impact both source and destination? And of course, this larger point that's coming in today's context, that is, is migration to large centers even desirable? Should people start? Should we have a more equitable spatial urban strategy? So the first point, this is one of the most stylized facts of pandemics, that people will go back. in the sense that migrants will want to go back home, and has particular salience in India because India's economy runs hugely on circular migrant labor. There's a huge difference between the kind of migrant labor we see in India versus in China. In China, both the men and women migrate in large numbers to cities, at least in the last 30 years. In India, historically and today, the men move much more to the cities than women for work. Of course, women are moving for marriage and all sorts of other reasons. But on work dimension, so you have this whole class of the single male migrants in our city, which also means that they are separated from their families. Okay. So a huge part of our cities, like especially cities like Delhi, Bombay, Surat, where a huge part of the workforce comes from rural India, not from urban India, but rural India. So rural to urban migration, not urban to urban migration. So I would say cities like Delhi, Surat, and Bombay are qualitatively very different from cities like Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, Pune, kind of IT hubs, which have drawn a lot of IT or urban to urban migration rather than rural to urban migration. So that's why Delhi and Surat and Mumbai have been typically on the news, especially last year for the migration exodus crisis, not so much these other cities. Now, in those places, what happens in a health crisis is that precisely because these families have not, these migrants have not come with their families, they have a high incentive to go back in the sense that they want to be with their families. That's a huge psychological concern. So the families back home also tell them, please come back, you might die in the city and so on. So that's one concern which is there. And what's interesting is what happened last year. We had the national lockdown for a variety of reasons. And of course, we got a full-blown migration crisis, hugely because the transport systems were shut down. People had to walk back. Very, very unfortunate visuals that we got. The similar thing, played out during the plague, where the British were mulling over whether they should shut down the railways or not in 1897 or so. And the British came to the conclusion that, even if we shut down the trains, these guys will walk back because the imperative to go back is still strong. And so the British actually arranged special trains, which even we did, but we did about 2 months late last year, those Shramik trains. Now, this fact that migrants will go back has been established in past pandemics of India. It's been established in the last year as well. And the fact that migrants will go back to the and also come back when conditions are much better, which we've seen in the past year and in the past pandemic, principally because the logic for rural to urban migration is very strong. You get much higher wages, livelihoods, your chances for upward mobility in life are much more than staying in the village in the first place. Now, last year we had a lot of interesting conversation of this is a good opportunity for India to kind of invest in those areas so that people don't have to migrate in the first place. But the fact is the places people are migrating from in India are extremely dense. It's almost impossible to create so many job opportunities in the agricultural sector in those places. So rural to urban migration, the way I see it, is inevitable, right? And so, I had talks with a lot of these, officials in Bihar and so on, where a lot of migrant people went back. And I said, pragmatically, the only thing you have to do is try and get them back to Delhi or wherever they're going as soon as possible. Because what are we going to do? Nobody's going to, even Manrega works for a particular class of people. But the bulk of the people who went back were not going to do Manrega jobs. A person who works as a cook or a plumber in a city will not take up a Manrega job. Because Manrega is by design for the absolute poor and so on. So there was an uptick in Manrega, but broadly people were just sitting idle back home because there were lack of opportunity. And it's impossible, with those kind of high rural population densities in Bihar, UP, West Bengal, it is impossible to create within 3-4 months facilities which will absorb them. And I say this because I've been studying this from a historical perspective. These regions have been sending out people for more than 100 years now. It was not going to take 3 months of investment to stop these migrations. There's also cultural logic of these migrations. When you grow up in these places, even Ratnagiri actually, if you grow up in these places, you're expected as part of a ritual to move out, explore the world, see the city, work for 10, 20 years, and then come back home. The part of return is also very, very important. Very few of these migrants from the eastern UP Bihar actually settle down in the cities. A few of them settle, but most of them go back. So that's the logic of migration. Now, how does it affect the economy? Of course, when they go back, it affects the industries in the cities, so they're going to be shut down. So what we've seen last year is a classic, balancing act, where in order for employers to get workers back, they have to actually incentivize. They have to pay us slightly more to get the workers back. So migrant workers also benefited marginally last year due to that slight disruption because they were wooed back into their workplace. Right? So this is an interesting thing that happened last year. So broadly, the impact on the local economy also is stark in the source region because a lot of these economies in the source region thrive on migrants' remittance. We think of Kerala as a classic remittance economy of India, where migrants go to the Gulf and send back money to Kerala. But that's happening in Rajasthan, UP, Bihar, where migrants from Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, all these places are sending back. So these villages are dependent on this migrant to be in the city and send money back. So what happened last year is that while not only did the industries of Bombay shut down because many of them because the migrants went back, the rural economies also collapsed because the migrant remittances collapsed. Right? So there's a classic kind of economic link between the source and the host. So it's in a very strange way, it's good for the rural economy if the migrant goes back to the city, because then the rural economy gets that remittance, which kind of fuels a lot of expenditure on various things. So remittance is a critical component of many of those districts in Bihar, Eastern UP, even West Bengal, and so on. So that's about that aspect. And so broadly, I would say, on that we should not be shutting down the railways and transport systems so abruptly, because what you'll get if you understand that there are two views on this. When you talk to people about why migrants are going back, you get two views. One is criticize the government, saying, they should have let the transport system open so that they could go back with dignity and so on. Yes. But there's also a class of views saying these migrants should stay in the city. What's so wrong in staying in the city for a few weeks? Why this hurry to go back home? Right? But the fact is that when they stay in the city without a job, they don't have income. Right? And so it's a cruel livelihood loss for them. And so they're making strategic calculation of whether to go back or not. Right? And a view is that if only the government had done a lot in terms of free ration, free everything, free food, etc., then the migrants would not have any incentive to go back because they were getting everything in the city for those people. Like just today, I think the Delhi government has announced free ration for even non-ration.
Yeah.
Right? Now these are good policies in the sense of having, but I would argue that in a pandemic, there is an economic reason to go back if you don't have a job. And so if the government comes in and says, look, we'll give you some support system, don't go back, it may work, but there is a larger logic of why people want to go back. As I said, agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge, that's sort of a logic. There is a psychological and cultural reason also, apart from the economic reason, as to why there's a pressure for people to go back. Having said that, we can clearly see what's happened between last year and this year. Last year, so many people went back. This year, fewer people have gone back. And that's because employers have stepped in. A lot of employers I know at construction sites have gone out of their way to kind of literally say, look, we'll give you all the benefits. If you stay on our sites, we'll treat you well, don't go back. So that's the learning that's happened, that the employers have smartened up and giving SOPs, giving incentives for people to not go back. So we've seen much less of a migrant exodus this year compared to last year. Though, of course, the pressure to go back is there. The other difference between last year and this year is, of course, the pandemic has reached rural areas. Last year there was this thing that this disease is the rich person's disease of the city, right? And if you go to the village, you're safe. Now, when all of India is affected, it's a lot of migrants are saying, it's better off staying in the city than going to the village, especially in UP and Bihar, where the situation right now is terrible in the rural area. So this is also between the devil and the deep sea, the kind of location choice of the migrant. Right? And this has happened in the past. When I studied the plague in Bombay, migrants had to choose between fleeing the plague in Bombay or the famine in Ratnagiri district. So are you going back to a situation of no food in the district, or do you want to stay in a place where you can potentially contract the plague? So these location choices are dependent on so many things. Wages, relative sense of health security, etc. So that's one aspect of migration. Now the other thing is about how are people in India moving to big cities? Is that going to fundamentally change after this pandemic? People moving to tier town. Anecdotally, just as you said, I have friends who have left Delhi and moved to Goa and many other places, saying, it's why pay the 50,000 rent in Delhi and I can pay 10,000 rent in Goa, have a great life, and still work because the pandemic has completely altered how we work. We can have Zoom calls. We can now work at a distance much more comfortably with good bandwidth connectivity and so on. It's a possibility, of course, that the pandemic might definitely assure more of these choices and so on. But again, from the long arc of history view, right?
Right.
The general tendency is for human beings to love congregation, and that is, we love urban agglomeration. Right? So there have been many technological advancements in the past which would, ideally hamper face-to-face kind of connectivity. Think of the IT industry as a classic example. You would think that the IT industry should be the least clustered industry in the world, right? Because you can always connect with the person, through your good IT system. But the fact is that the IT industry is the most clustered industry in the world. You have Silicon Valley, you have Bangalore, you have those clusters in Israel, and that's because there are certain logic of an urban cluster, precisely because it minimizes cost for labor transfer. So you can move to other places very quickly. If you lose a job here, you can go to others. It benefits both employees and employers if you're all in the same location at the same time. Right now, people are saying that the difference now is good bandwidth connectivity. I don't think that's enough of a reason for people to fundamentally start rethinking urban agglomeration. So I'm a bit skeptical of claims that this will fundamentally change India's urban landscape, where many people will leave big cities and so on. I think the long arc of history suggests that people do tend to go to larger cities than smaller towns. It could be that a few smaller towns, start exploding and so on. Like Surat is one of India's fastest growing cities and so on. But eventually the top 10, if you look at the top 6 cities of India, I don't think there's going to be a fundamental change. Like whether you look at Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, and so on. So my broad view on this is that this is the reality is that it's not going to change much. The other point is whether it's desirable. That is, whether you want to have an urban policy strategy which kind of reduces the pressure on the big cities and have people moving to more of these smaller cities. And that can happen only if you invest a lot in smaller towns in terms of urban amenities, in terms of a variety of things. The catch-22 situation is there is if you make smaller towns so good that people start going there, they will become big cities. So this is from an economic kind of equilibrium logic. However you look at it, the move is towards agglomeration, right? The move is towards more. So you think of people moving from Bangalore to Mysore. Who knows? Mysore will become bigger than Bangalore in 30, 40 years, right? And so,
Right.
so the broader kind of point I want to make is that people are definitely leaving villages for larger clusters. There is no way that we're going to see a reversal of that. So we can leave that out. There might be a few people, interested in organic farming. They might have a farm, but they will have a location in both places. They will have a leg in the village, but they also, have a leg because the urban economy the logic of urban agglomeration from an economics point of view is so powerful that it makes very little sense to leave. So whether it's desirable or not, when I have looked at big cities and smaller cities, I've lived in 4 of India's big cities. I've also lived in some of the smaller cities. The way I see it is, should the government be investing in these things? I think the government should be have kind of a good broad-based urban policy approach which tries to improve amenities everywhere in urban cities. I think the larger problem in India is not whether it's between big cities or small cities. It's that we don't have enough of rural to urban migration happening in the first. China has got 100 large cities. We have 4 or 5, large cities which are absorbing a lot of that. Right? So we need many more cities which can absorb the much larger volumes of rural to urban migration that's going to only increase in the coming years. I think that's the largest story. So broadly put, we have these 4 or 5 big cities of India. We need actually more such cities in India to absorb, because no country in the world has gone from being poor to rich without a process of urbanization. Right? And India is one of actually the slowest urbanizing countries in the world. China is just urbanizing way faster than us. This transfer from village to taking people off farms to away from farms is happening so slowly in India. And so if we invest enough in not just a few cities across the board, we'll see a larger growth across a whole suite of cities. So we need more larger cities than a few larger cities. That's how I see this whole thing about urban spatial strategy and so on.
This in itself, the urbanization, I think this itself would require a complete, 90-minute discussion around this. So I'm going to hold that thought here, Chinmay, because there are a couple more questions that I have to ask you, and I'm going to certainly come back to you on the urbanization question of urbanization, because I know there are a lot of debates, public debates in the public policy domain. Very quickly, the point you made about Delhi intervening, the Delhi government intervening, and uh, 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 with grants. To people who have been affected. And you followed it up the, by making the point that people who are impacted, they also, it's not just financial, the impact on them is both sociological and psychologically debilitating. Now, on the one hand, that you think that it's a great policy because it offers a financial package, but the sociological and psychological impact is also got to be factored. Now, how do you reconcile this dichotomy, so to speak?
Yeah, it's very tough. I think what the Delhi government has done is very rational because they want people to be there also, right? It's going to be very tough for them to meet the social and psychological expectations, and this economic thing to some extent kind of levers that. I think the only thing I can say is that you know the migrants themselves have seen what happened last year, right? And last year was a particularly bad time for them, not only as an income shock, but the indignity of walking back home for many of them. And so, in a way, I think the thing right now is more of, I mean, they're comparing this year versus the last year. That is the way a lot of these calculations are being made. So I think while migrants will be happy about this announcement, uh, the social and financial thing, it's very tough for the government to do anything. But the fact is that today UP and Bihar, which are the two primary states for outmigration, have been badly hit by COVID-19 in the rural area. And so now it's kind of, last year their families were concerned about migrants in the cities. Today the migrants in the cities are concerned about the health of people back home. Right? And so that has kind of fundamentally switched between 2020 and 2021.
Sure. Okay. Now, Chinmay, one interesting aspect that you've touched upon in the book is the social churn that happens in the political domain. And during influenza, for instance, you've spoken about the emergence of people such as, about the emergence of Gandhi, about Tilak, about Sardar Patel, among others. Now, a few questions that occur here. For instance, um, you offered pointers to why did this happen as well at that point in time in history, and that there was the British rule was there. Um, uh, you know, two questions that occur here to my mind: is it possible to imagine such kind of shifts in the contemporary narrative where that we are situated in now? And the second part is that, since the time you wrote the book, and you are a witness to events, you've been witnessing events as it is unfolding, and as a researcher as well, who is looking at potential uh, economic and political outcomes as it unfolds. If I were to ask you to examine the outcomes as it unfolds, because it may lie across a spectrum, what may they possibly be as it look like to you?
Yeah, like I've argued in my book, at least plague and influenza, they created a new class of political leaders. They created new movements, labor movement, cooperative movement, variety of things like that. I think in India, first of all, they ought to be a movement for greater health, greater focus on health. But coming very specifically on the political kind of fallout, I think the second wave is going to have a political fallout, in the sense that we might not anticipate as well now. But obviously, it needs an articulation. I mean, the fact that it could happen in the past was because you had stalwarts like, well, stalwarts in hindsight, right? In that time, people were not seeing that when they first were engaging with the pandemic, whether it was still up Gokhale and all, they were not seen as something. We call them stalwarts today with the benefit of hindsight. But those guys really, countered the British. They pinpointed why the British were not. I mean, a part of a pandemic is serendipity, luck, bad luck, right? But a part of it is management. How are you responding to the crisis? And a lot of how the British responded to plague and influenza was shortage. So if you think of oxygen shortages today, think of food shortages in 1918, which aggravated the influenza. I mean, the fact that 20 million Indians need not have died during the influenza pandemic of 1918. Now, the true numbers of the current pandemic will, I think, be established. I mean, closer to the truth numbers will be established only a few years down the line, unfortunately. But the numbers are definitely not 270,000 that the government is reporting today. It is substantially more than that. And so the first task for any person is to see how much of this can be attributed to mismanagement. And this is not just about, say, the central government, but at the state government level. Right? So, which state governments have taken a proactive role in management? We can't attribute 270,000 reported COVID deaths completely to bad luck. A lot of this is because of bad management as well, right? And so we need to kind of demand accountability for this across state governments at the union government level and so on. So I do believe the second wave has been so devastating, which is not really clear yet, to us in terms of the numbers, because this is something I'm also working on, death underreporting and so on. The numbers are very stark, and for such stark numbers, you would get some political ramifications. So one is, of course, the fallout, but it will also create a new class of leaders, which we will know only 20 or 30 years down the line. These are young political leaders who are in relief work right now, on the ground doing relief work. And so just like, we say, yes, Sardar Patel was a great freedom fighter, but he started his first public, work in the Ahmedabad plague of 1917. He was a ward member in the Ahmedabad municipality. So like that, in 2040 and 50, hypothetically, if Sonu Sood becomes prime minister, we'll say, oh, he earned his spurs. He earned his spurs during the COVID pandemic or. So I think that's the kind of legacy. We'll see so many people who will be important leaders in 2035, 2050, who will look back on their careers and say, this was the pivotal turning point where we got out on the streets, started helping people. And that's how I think what we'll see. Because this is India's largest crisis since the partition of 1947. I have absolutely no doubt about that. In terms of just the sheer death toll that we're going to eventually see, the economic contraction of last year, but this year it's a base effect. But overall, the economy has been pretty much flat for now 2 years in a row. The livelihood destruction, the destruction of life. We've really not had a year like this since 1947. So, it's going to bring forth a new crop of leaders at the grassroots level across political parties who will grow up and in 20 years down the line be leading this country.
It's very interesting that you mentioned you spoke of that. Whoever would have imagined Sonu Sood, for instance, the point that you made, that he would emerge in this avatar. As we move towards the final parts, a few questions that stay at the back of the mind. There's an interesting observation, Chinmay, that you make towards the end of the book about pandemic management, where you speak, that it almost always involves the dispersal of crowds, and you add there that it also involves the curtailment of some religious freedoms and civil liberties, which is almost always a political issue that the British discovered in the 19th century. Now, I spent some time thinking about that assertion that you made, that observation rather, that you made there. And I was trying to extrapolate that into our contemporary narrative as it is playing out in India. Now, we have the UP elections that are coming up. We have a dispensation at the center that has seen a few setbacks, and by any which yardstick, it seems to be an authoritarian, or for lack of a better word, it is an authoritarian prime minister who calls the shots. And is it possible that if in the BJP's assessment that it may not do well, and Uttar Pradesh is an important state to retain control of, if it suspects or if it foments that there may be trouble in the air, is it possible, given your reading of history and the past, how pandemics have panned out in the past. Can we imagine a possibility that that some kind of civil liberties can be clamped down upon in some form or the other?
Yeah, I think this question of how much should civil liberties be clamped down. I mean, classic case of U.S. When they said wear masks, so many states in the U.S. say, "Oh, nothing doing. This is clamping down on civil liberties. I will not wear a mask, and who are you to stop me?" Right? So this is just one notion of civil liberty. And similarly in India, there's a curfew, but we have to go to the local market, and we're going to congregate in large numbers, and you can't do anything about it. So this Epidemic Disease Act, which is really what we're talking about here, came about in the context of the British trying to curtail the plague in 1897. And that is the same act through which we are dealing with COVID, right, with some minor tweaks here and there. Now that act was very harsh, very coercive. I believe that some parts of this are necessary because you have to have some restrictions. You have to have some. If a person is just going around, when people are supposed to be off the streets, I believe you can arrest that person, as simple as that, right? But how much power do you give the police? Right? So can a police person go about, crashing about street vendors' cart, as we saw some of the visuals last year, shocking visuals. There's also this overexertion of power, right, which comes the minute you give this right to clamp down upon civil liberties. That's why you need independent checks. You need to have the judiciary. You need to have independent bodies to see if this law is not being misused. I think that's how these checks and balances need to work in any system. So I'm definitely not of the opinion that nothing is more satisfying than civil liberties. And even if it's a pandemic, you can do what you want. No, I think in a pandemic there is a responsibility of a government to say no. If we think you should stay at home, if that reduces the chances of mass mortality, then this is something we should abide by. But I think this whole thing about the law clamping down on civil liberties, people's response. It is about, at the end of the day, it's about how do we as a society respond, right? That is, if there's a law which says that, I would say in Taiwan today or in Singapore, if there's a law which says, don't go out after 6 p.m. because X, Y, Z, people will respect it. So there has to be that credibility, right? Through which then people's behavioral patterns themselves change. Now, during the first before and after the first wave, people are very skeptical of all these policies. Now, with the second wave, it's been so devastating. Obviously, our behavioral patterns will change. So if the government says something, don't do this, we're going to be actually more respectful of that, in the sense that we have seen how bad it can get in the last few weeks. That clearly now that the thing will change a little bit. But so ultimately, when you think of clamping down civil liberties, it's a kind of a back and forth game between the government and the public. Right? If the public is going to behave completely irresponsibly, then there's very little that the government can do in public. So we need to, going forward, how do we deal with this? Is that we need better communication of the risks of the pandemic to the public. This, I believe, was done last year. When the Prime Minister announced the national lockdown, for all its other mistakes in terms of migrant crisis and so on, the communication was, at least in my view, clear that this is a potential crisis that we need to collectively act against. We didn't really see that in the last 1 month. We saw all these other events going on. As late as mid-April, people were boasting about the size of the election rallies and so on, when the pandemic had already gone out of proportion. So at that point, even if you have the Epidemic Disease Act, if you see a local politician at an election rally, who is going to adhere to any of these protocols which were established by late March and April in many of these states? Right? And so that's why the demonstration effect of political leadership is so important. That is, you can't say, oh, you guys have to stay at home, but I will go at the election rally. That kind of lost the credibility throughout March and April, I believe. I mean, if you ask me, were elections important super spreader events and all? That is, for scientists to say, in the sense how much would they critical. But they were definitely critical in kind of losing credibility of enforcing any protocol. Right? That is, a lot of people who would not have gone to these election rallies did not take COVID seriously enough in March and up to say mid-April, precisely because these election rallies were being beamed on our screens day in and day out. So it's more of the demonstration effect of those rallies, which basically meant that the people are not taking those protocols seriously. So on civil liberties, I think it's a back and forth game, between government and the public. But the government, has to take much more responsibility in a pandemic in articulating its goals, what it's trying to do. And then I think, the public is likely to behave in a much more responsible manner, in which case you won't even need to use some of these protocols developed for the Epidemic Disease Act 1897. And so on.
So that reminds me of the anecdote you shared about the Maharashtra government handling the Pandharpur festival and the communication channels it opened and the conversation and how it handled the entire festival and the yatra.
Yeah, I mean, even the Prime Minister, very late in the day, he told the Kumbh Mela people, okay, now enough, have a symbolic. Of course, it came too late in the day. But if that had been done, 2 months earlier, or they're not just held the event, even better, that would have been much better. So a lot of these things, I think, could have been done, which is very unfortunate because let me just talk a bit of the personal experience of viewing the last 1 month. It has really been a replay for me of 1918. 1918, the first wave was mild, the second wave was devastating. The dead bodies floating in the Ganga, thankfully not as much as in 1918, but still very stark. Some journalists accounting more than 2,000 bodies so far detected and so on. It's been very depressing because it's literally like, we've seen it. We've seen it once before, and we simply did not take this possibility of the second wave. And we kind of muddled ourselves with all sorts of crazy hypotheses that we are exceptional. Some sort of exceptionalism had creeped into the system. There was a lot of evidenceless triumphalism in January and February. The classic document for this is the Economic Survey of India. I think it's a classic study in the future of how you can get swayed by your own self-serving logic. What the Economic Survey, and I mentioned this in the book. To look good, you often take the worst benchmark for, right? And so in India, politician after politician of the ruling dispensation today is telling us, look, things are not good, but it's much worse in the US. It's much worse in Britain. It's much worse in Germany. And they're true in terms of per capita, though of course that's also not very true now. When we get the actual, we're looking at reported deaths, the actual deaths are much higher. The fact is that, and I tweeted this in February, when you compare 200 countries in the world, even before the second wave, India was in the bottom half of the list on both deaths per capita, COVID deaths per capita, reported COVID deaths per capita, and economic contraction. Right? So the two basic measures, when you say the trade-off between lives and livelihoods, right, the two metrics is going to be GDP growth, which we had the biggest contraction in the world because we had the harshest lockdown. You would have thought that we have very low deaths per capita. We continuously compare ourselves to US, UK and so on. But when you look at the whole world, even in the first wave, we were not doing very well. We had the worst COVID death rate in South Asia. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka had better metrics than us. So we fooled ourselves with this continuous benchmarking with one or two countries. And the Economic Survey is a classic document. They have these charts which shows India as the best performing countries with 19 other countries. But if you look at 200 countries, we're in the bottom half. So it's kind of a self-serving kind of denial mode, what I call is evidenceless triumphalism that really got us unprepared for the second wave. And if these kind of things were not done in January, February, I do believe if we had just followed what was happening in the second wave across the country, we would have been much more better prepared. So this is a lot of complacency was self-inflicted by this kind of evidenceless triumphalism. And that's why history is such a strong reminder that such things can happen, that a second wave can be devastating. And so I say this with a slight sense of frustration because I've written this book. I've kind of when I open the newspaper headlines, newspaper reports today, it's almost like what I've seen headlines of various newspapers of 1918 or newspapers. Because for my research, I've had to look at newspapers of those times. Sitting in the Nehru Memorial Library, which has these microfilms, all these newspapers on microfilms, and I've been scanning through, say, a newspaper like Searchlight, which was based in Patna, and you see 1918 the accounts of influenza deaths out there, or the Tribune in Lahore, And I've gone through all these newspapers, and you see the headlines, and they have the same death scorecards that we're seeing today. They have those accounts of bodies in the Ganga. It's almost like a replay, of that crazy year that we had in 1980. Hopefully, we don't have as many deaths because that was 20 million. We are not. It's very unlikely that we'll reach that number. But it's been a lot of it has been needless, I think. In this perspective.
Talking about replays, Chinmay, on that note, what did it do to that generation? Because you spoke about lockdowns, shut schools that were shut down, and all of that is replaying itself right now. What did it do to that generation? Because I am personally terrified of, what is it doing to kids who are at home? What is it doing to people who are locked up at homes? How do you see itself replaying? Clearly, we have traveled a long way since then. There are technologies to cope with all of it. But are we going to witness a scarred generation in some sense? Because I have come across conflicting sets of studies, both of which, you know, some that suggest that you are going to have higher levels of productivity on the one hand, the others which suggest that you will have lower levels of productivity. On children, I have seen conflicting reports, which speak about how their development is going to be impeded, and yet others which suggest that no, in the longer term, they'll turn out to be just fine. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, it's a bit, of course, tough to kind of forecast what's going to happen say, in the next 10 years. Of course, as an Indian citizen, I would hope that we have fantastic growth rates and we become. I think the first thing we need to stop doing is this continuous idea of when will India become a superpower. I think the first thing that we should just admit is that we have a long way to go. Is this humility to say, these targets like $5 trillion economy targets and so on are kind of completely pointless when we have such woeful medical health infrastructure that is now being exposed by this pandemic. Right? I think we have to just, like we say in cricket, when you have a target to chase, say 450 overs, if you ask any of these targets which have ever been changed, they'll always tell you, these cricketers will tell you, we were not thinking of the target, we were playing it ball by ball. Right? That's exactly what we need to do. Just take it year by year and just see, okay, can we get jobs? Jobs is a fundamental crisis right now. I mean, you as a parent, I as a parent, I'm as a parent, I'm hugely concerned about the future in terms of jobs. And so that's where, all the focus should lie. Health, of course, if we put priority there, so many jobs so many jobs can be created in the health sector. Right? I mean, that's what the pandemic is also showing. So while at one level, I'm an eternal optimist, about India, I think the pandemic is a useful kind of reminder. I mean, just think of, I think I was just reading today, Abdul Kalam had this book, India 2020. And, we are here in 2021 running out of goods for cremation, for cremation ground. It's a horrific state to be in. I mean, if Abdul Kalam was alive, you'd be turning, you'd just be like shocked at the situation that we find ourselves in. So, hopefully, we do well. Is the pandemic going to activate a lot of this? It will happen only if there's accountability. And I think that it starts first by demanding accountability from our state governments, from the union government, to admit firstly that there's been massive lapses in the lead up to this pandemic, and then do course correction. Unfortunately, the skeptical side of me says nothing of this is going to happen. In 1918, there were Indian politicians who said nothing, never again will we have such a big calamity. We're going to invest a lot in health. We need to invest more in health. India continuously, after 100 years, we are still one of the most underfunded public health systems in the world. So there's a continuous contest within me, at least, between this eternal optimist and this skeptical side, which says nothing will really change until we have political leaders who see the potential of India and go beyond marketing gimmicks. This constant thing, oh, India is already a superpower, the whole world respects us. I mean, the respect comes when you are, the focus should be on per capita income rather than, the total income. So not have $5 trillion targets, but have 20,000 per capita income kind of targets. I think that's the kind of relevant metric that we should be in. I mean, absolute size matters absolutely nothing when it comes to the average quality of life for the Indian people. So I've not really answered your question, but all I can say is that is we need to go away from trances, from exceptions, and say, there are countries like South Korea which have transformed within a generation, and we can do that. But that will not happen with some sort of, sloganeering, acronyming of policies and so on. It needs a sustained effort across governments. These governments will change at some point across governments. In a way, the story from 1991, onwards has been so, in my view, so much better than the world before 1991. It was sustained. Whichever political party came to, they maintained certain basic amount of reforms over time. Uh, but the pandemic has shown the weaknesses, in especially in health. And so that definitely needs a massive course correction. Because if you don't get health right, nothing else. We're going to have. I mean, this pandemic is, about deaths and so on. But even in pre-pandemic times, we had some of the worst health parameters. We had undernutrition, malnutrition. So we aren't developing human beings to their full capacity. So that's the fundamental downside of having a weak health. So like you mentioned to your daughter, you should definitely get into biology or some field which is there. Completely agree that these are the fields of the future. Some scientists say biology is the science of the 21st century. If physics was for the 20th century, and maybe there's an element of truth in that. But not just that. I think there's so many fields opening up, that and so many places that one can think of investing huge amount of resources in. So yeah, so I'll end with that little rant.
Yeah, so Chinmay, much like you, I'm an optimist as well, and I believe in the India story, and like you said, it's got to be, like to use the cricketing metaphor, when it's down to the last over, you take it one ball at a time when you're in the crunch time. It's been fantastic talking to you, and I've much like your book, this conversation has been an eye opener for me as well, and I've totally enjoyed listening to you. Thank you so much, Chinmay, and thank you for taking the time out. Really
Thanks,
appreciate this, and
thanks so
look
much.
forward to all of what you're going to put out next.